Okay, we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another day at Mission Top. I like to lead off all of these episodes explaining a little bit about what Mission Top is. Mission Top is a farmstead and ranch, and you very well may hear the sounds of a farmstead and ranch as we go. But Mission Top is much more than that. It is a family, my family. My name is Gary Nuila, but it is also a place of ideas. It is an exploration of a way of life. It is a process. It is many things, such as a kingdom, an identity. These are things we've talked about in the past and how they relate to that. And today I'll even say that Mission Top, in a way, is a temple, or at least we're trying to lay it out in a pattern like a temple in terms of being a map of meaning in its very structure. And so by the end of today's episode, hopefully that will make sense of how that would be possible in such a place as even a farmstead and ranch. So welcome to this series on understanding temples by way of the Latter-day Saint temple. This is a series that is seeking an in-depth understanding of what temples are across humanity. So while it is going to be referring back again and again to the Latter-day Saint temple worship kind of complex of rituals within their temples, to use kind of a potent contemporary example and also say more about that example, which a lot of people find confusing and a little bit mysterious. But at the end of the day, this is a series about temples in general across humanity. So the goal of it is a general understanding of temples and something that is applicable to anyone, whether you are somebody who is non-religious, religious, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or not. I have tried to design this series so that you gain benefit from it. I should explain that this is a rough draft of this series for something that ultimately I want not to be live, but these live streams are a way of me presenting the ideas and getting them out there, and also seek your feedback. So you're welcome to participate as we go along, and I hope you do. It enriches and enlivens the whole experience on these and helps me to hone these ideas so that they can be turned into a non-live kind of polished format, which is going to be hopefully the ultimate and kind of ending version of this series. So this is also a series meant, again, to, well, I guess I should say it this way. Ultimately, the goal of this series is to help reinvigorate your relationship to the temples that surround you in culture. Because one of kind of the underlying assumptions behind this series is that temples exist everywhere. They have as far back as we can look in humanity, and they continue to exist even in a world that kind of has convinced itself that it is more secular, more scientifically minded, and has done away with, the gods and the spirits in large sense. Yet these temples continue to exist. So the aim of this series is to help reinvigorate people to see the temples that surround you, and to understand their importance and the transformative experiences you can have within them in your culture's temples, right? Maybe ones that you do know around you, but you don't understand how you could engage with them. Temples in your own tradition, if you have a religious tradition or not. And then finally, this series will hopefully help you see how you undoubtedly probably already worship at temples, which you might not even realize were temples. Once you realize kind of the groupings of characteristics that temples have, then you start to see things such as the last time in the introductory episode, we mentioned a sports arena is very much a temple, and all the sorts of rituals and practices that go on there, and the kind of communal experiences, ecstatic experiences of transformation and belonging and identity that people experience there at a sports arena. That's a temple, and many people worship there, right? It's where they form a core part of their identity, to the point that they, again, will wear that identity around with them wherever they go, on their hat, perhaps all day, right? Because they're seeking to be part of something, all right? And so, again, if that is a temple, then what other things might be temples? So This is all, again, the intro to help you kind of look back at the world and see the temples around you and engage in those that you want to engage with, and maybe expose a little bit the ones you already are engaging with that you didn't think were temples, and maybe you don't want to have the transformative experience of the temples that you were kind of unbeknownst to you already worshiping at. Okay, so this episode is called Maps of Meaning, and we're going to talk today about how temples are maps of meaning, how they are a guiding point, a reference point, just as a map is a map of geospatial coordinates. A temple is also a map. So we're going to explain how that is the case. So to begin with, I would like to kind of take you through a series of exercises that kind of have you try to place yourself within a certain perspective, okay? And the first thing we're going to start about is having you imagine yourself in a barren wasteland. Have this image here to kind of help us to get into that mood. And in this wasteland, as far as the eye can see, there's nothing but undulating sand dunes. There are no distinguishing features in the landscape. There's no trees, bodies of water to distinguish any view from another. As far around as you look, it would look something like this image. You have differences in the landscape, but not enough that you can actually distinguish anything from anywhere else. So you have no idea which way you came from or where, geographically you're located. So even if you could distinguish north from south using the movement of the sun or something like that, which is kind of irrelevant to this, you wouldn't know which direction you want to go because you don't know, which direction would be the best direction to go. And so that suggests an important question, right? You have to figure out, where do I want to go? And let's suppose you don't know that. And unless we do more to specify what your destination is and what your goals and motivations are, then, as the Cheshire Cat famously said in Alice in Wonderland, it doesn't matter which way you go. You have to get to something before and say, well, what do you want, right? What are your goals? So in order to be able to talk in terms of successful or unsuccessful actions in like a landscape like this, you have to first know where you are. You first have to know who you are, right? And what you are. And you have to know where it is that you want to go. Okay, so let's end that little scenario, and we'll come back to it in a while, but now I'm going to give you a few other scenarios here, okay? So this time, you find yourself in a great arena. Let's imagine it's this top one right here. So you're in this great arena. You're in the center of a field that's unmarked, of perfectly cut green grass, and all around you are tens of thousands of men, women, and children looking down at you, right? You're the center of attention. So and everyone seems to have an eager expectation of your next actions, only you don't know what it is you're expected to do, right? You can see this is a place of acting, and people are looking at you, expecting you to act, but you don't know what you are supposed to do. So maybe you venture to take a step forward, and immediately, maybe you hear a chorus of snickers from the crowd, right? And think how you would feel in that scenario. At least to me, it would be absolutely terrifying, right? You're the center of the world as far as you can see, and you don't know what it is you're supposed to do, or who you are, or what you're capable of, right? So equally terrifying would be to find yourself in that same arena. So imagine kind of changing the scenario a little bit, only this time you look around and the pristine green grass has been marked in a gridiron, right? So now you do realize where you are. It's the Super Bowl. It's the Patriots versus the Chiefs. The ball's about to be hiked. You're standing right there in the quarterback's position. Only you look and you're not the quarterback, right? You're wearing a white sporty outfit with a skirt. You're holding a green tennis ball and a racket, because you suddenly realize you're Serena Williams. That's who you are. And once again, how would that feel to be in the Super Bowl? You find you're Serena Williams. You're standing there in the quarterback's position, but you are not ready to be the quarterback, right? Once again, that would be terrifying. There's a sense of horror in that because there's a misalignment, right, between the relationship of the arena that you find yourself in. Because in the second example, you realize what arena you're in. You're in, the Super Bowl. You know what this arena is about, but you realize you are the wrong person to be in that arena. And so that mismatch, that misalignment of arena and actor, you could say, would be terrifying. Okay? So now contrast those kind of scenarios with another setting. So this time you are once again in an arena. Let's imagine it's this bottom picture here, and you recognize immediately the setting. You are at Wimbledon, okay, a championship match just about to begin. And in fact, the more you look around, you notice who you are. You look at yourself and you kind of got it. You're Pete Sampras. This is kind of going to date me because this is when I last paid attention to tennis. But anyway, across the court from you is Andre Agassi. You've got the ball in your hand. You've got the racket in the other. You're standing there at the baseline with everyone's eyes on you with eager anticipation. And so in this scenario, you know exactly where you are. You know who you are, right? You know what you're capable of. And you know what you are supposed to do here. So you know what will mean success and what will mean failure in this scenario. So this last one, as opposed to these three previous scenarios we've given, in this last one, there is an alignment between arena. I've used on purpose these sports arenas because we know exactly what an arena is. There's an alignment of that arena with you, the agent or the actor in the arena. So in that, imagine how that would feel. And when we are in those kind of scenarios in life, and when there's that alignment between agent and arena, of knowing who you are, what you're supposed to do, and feeling capable of doing it, that's the best feeling in the world, right? Because it's tied up with those feelings of flow and kind of those states of consciousness that are most engaging to us. When we have something to do, we know we can do it, and there's kind of a progress laid out in front of us, right? So all these scenarios I've asked you to imagine yourself in are representations, right? Representations or representations of life as we experience it. Not a few human beings have had the experience at one moment or another in their life of not knowing where they are or where they're supposed to go, or sometimes even who and what they really are, right? Only the landscape they find themselves placed in without any bearings is not a physical landscape, and oftentimes, but it's a landscape of meaning. Usually we kind of know where we are in the physical landscape. But increasingly in the world, I would argue, people complain, even openly, about not knowing where they are in the landscape of meaning, okay? And so we are used to evaluating our lives in these physical dimensions that are taught to us, kind of the ones that are presented to us most in schooling and in general culture, which largely presents the arena of the world to us in a scientific kind of worldview. That's where we even say scientific worldview. We see the world around us in scientific terms. Okay, and so what are scientific terms that we're taught to kind of see the world in? GPS coordinates placed on a Google map, calories, nutrients such as proteins, fat, and carbohydrates. We're taught to think in terms of hormones, neurotransmitters, atoms, temperatures. All those are supposed to give us indicators in this world in this scientific worldview of what's going on and how to act within it. And so these things do help us to know where we're located in time and space. They help us to know what we're composed of, right? Our physical health, our mental state. But all the while, we assume that all these physical mapping systems, which help us know the physical state of things, is the only important kind of dimension which we need. We've kind of convinced ourselves, all can be solved with science. We did a whole episode like a week back or more than a week back on how, like in COVID, that's been the primary concern, hasn't it? It's been a scientific look at things. We've been talking in terms of, the virus and mutations and vaccinations and things of that nature in order to kind of tell us what's going on in the world. Well, meanwhile, there's been other things going on in the world at the same time, but they've been more, let's say, confusing to people because they lie in that landscape of meaning, and we become not as good at knowing what's going on in terms of meaning. Okay? And so the landscape of meaning, as opposed to these physical indicators it's given us, deals not with how things work per se, but what is important. What's important, what's not important. Again, going to COVID, that's where you have to ask, did we do the things, we did the things to eliminate kind of this scientific phenomenon as it was presented to us, but did we sacrifice more important things along the way? Because we weren't thinking in terms of a hierarchy of importance, of values, right? Because that's the landscape of meaning. What's valuable? What's not valuable? What do we want? What should we not want, right? We kind of take for granted, oftentimes in life, that these things will just kind of happen. We'll just know the answers to those things. What's to value, what's important, what's not important, what should we want, what should we not want. And society gives us a basic kind of narrative to operate under. You're a member of society, you're supposed to be a productive member of society, you should go to school, you should accomplish, you should have a career, you should make money, make as much money as you can, buy things, have some kids, raise your kids, buy as big a home as you can, go on some vacations, retire someday, have some fun with your grandkids, and you die, There it is. There's a story to live in that basically society gives you along the way, and try to stay as healthy as you can be physically and mentally along the way, right? But, and that works, and that's what the story most people live in day to day. But that kind of story, that kind of framework, doesn't offer the answers to the questions that sometimes when you're laying there at bed at night, not able to sleep, it doesn't provide the answers to the questions that might be going through your mind then, such as, what does this all mean, right? Where did this all come from? This whole thing, society and the world and me in it. Does it mean anything? Who am I really? Like, I've been kind of told who I was in my life. I've played this part that I was supposed to play, going to school, being good, whatever it may be. But is that really, who I was supposed to be? Was this really what I was supposed to do? Have I paid attention to the right things in life? What's relevant and what's not relevant? What's salient and what's not salient? It turns out there are infinite things you can do in life. There's infinite things you can pay attention to. In any given moment, there is infinite courses of action around you in the world, infinite things to pay attention to. And you, as a human, have this dilemma that you're there made to act, and you have to say, what is important here? What is relevant, salient? What should I value? What should I not? Okay? And increasingly common in this world is people feeling, going back to our examples here that I have still up, misalignments between themselves as an agent in the world and the arena that they find themselves around. So this general story I told you of just kind of going to work, getting an education, having a career, yada, yada, people look out and they say, this is a story, I'm expected to act in it, but either I don't feel like I'm the right, agent in this arena, or I think something's wrong with the arena. This is not an arena that I want to be in. And so people feel this misalignment, right, between their agent and arena. Or people, they start to question, is this really who I'm meant to be? And they have suspicions that they're not, there's something in them that they really are, and that they haven't been told who they are. Sometimes people there's a feeling that there's more going on beneath the surface of the world. There can be sometimes feelings of some evil overlord or, conspiracy of people kind of really running things and keeping people in slavery and like minions. So this can very easily lead to conspiratorial type of thinking in some people, or feelings of horror in others, again, of just like feeling out of joint with the world. Or nihilism, which is where people say, I've got it figured out. It doesn't mean anything, right? This world, no matter what you do, it doesn't amount to much. I'm not very capable in it. And, frankly, I don't like this world, and I'm going to do what I can to not participate in it or destroy it. And there are those people out there that come to try to destroy the world because they don't find that it's a very engaging world. Okay? And we have lots of stories that deal with this kind of these kind of disjoints that we feel in the world. And guess what? We love them. We love these kinds of stories. Here's one. It's called Harry Potter, right? Kid starts out. And who is he? He's in this arena in the world. He's an agent in it. And, it's not a very good world. He has to live under the stairs. There's people that abuse him. There's kind of evil overlords over him. He doesn't feel like he, has much a place to act in this world. And there's a suspicion that there's something more, is this the real world? And this really who I am? And, then Hagrid shows up one day, of course, and says, "You're a wizard, Harry," right? And all of us, when we see that part, we're just like, oh, yes, like there's something inside of us that says, yes, maybe I am more too, and then you go and you go through the, the portal there, the train station, and you're in Diagon Alley, and here's the real world, right? So underneath this flat kind of material world of just careers and things like that, well, look, here's this magical world that really lied underneath the surface. And you, in fact, have an important part to play in this magical world. You're a wizard. And it turns out you're not only the wizard, you're the chosen wizard. There's a great battle of light and dark going on, and you are a chosen person who has an important place to play in it all, right? And so you see, like, we eat these stories up. And then given the choice between the regular world and a story like Harry Potter story, a lot of people say, I'd rather participate in that one. So what do? They dress up, they read the books. How many times? Again and again. They immerse themselves in that world. They imagine themselves as the characters. They play the video games, everything. Why? Because that world's more engaging, that arena. And they feel like they're an agent, that they would rather be an agent in that world. They more feel an appropriate kind of balance in that world. Okay, here's another one, the Matrix, right? How does the Matrix start out? Same kind of scenario. You've got this guy who has these suspicions, Neo, right, that he's something more than he is. In fact, he's Mr. Anderson, right? It's not even Neo, but he has this other identity, Neo. And there's hints from kind of beyond saying, we know that you're having suspicions. There's something else out here, Neo, and come join us. There's something else going on. And so there's that whole first scenario of the movie, which I think is one of the reasons people love it, of Neo learning that there's a different reality out there, right? And this possibility that there's more going on than we think, and that he has a place to play in it, and that ultimately he can choose, right? The danger and the excitement of going into the real world, right? The blue pill, red pill situation, or does he stay and just kind of live in the mundane world of living how everybody's telling you, and including the evil overlords that seem to kind of be trying to keep everyone in their place, right? So once again, you see why would we eat these stories up? Why would these be these titanic forces in culture unless in some way they resonated with how the world sometimes feels to us? Now, am I suggesting that, that's exactly how we should see the world? Or, am I suggesting that conspiratorial thinking is right or productive? No, there's nuances to this all, right? But what I'm trying to point out is how many people do feel these kinds of feelings in the world. Yeah, it's funny. Ed just came on and said the Matrix also comes to mind, and so that's exactly what we led into. So, and we could go on with the examples. There's so many examples of stories that have this kind of setup in them of, you learn that there's more going on out there, and you have this place to play in it. And so you can see how a lot of people, once they realize that there's these alternative stories that they could live in, these alternative worlds, whether it be Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, the Marvel Universe, anime, or all sorts of internet subcultures, video game cultures, a lot of people say, this regular world that I'm presented with, this regular arena that I'm in, I don't like it too much, and I'd rather be in these more engaging other worlds. So they tune out, and they end up spending the majority of their days in these other worlds, kind of exiting just to, do the bare subsistence of life, eating, drinking, sleeping, that kind of thing, and then they're right back into these worlds. And in a sense, those of us that do kind of live more in this normal world, I guess you could say, are a little bit baffled about why do they keep on doing that? Why are there increasingly people that are like that? Am I missing out on something in these worlds? And we want to check them out and feel them out, and etc. So given that setup, hopefully now we are in a place to kind of adequately present what a temple has always been in society, as it relates to these scenarios that we put ourselves in, that it's not natural that we just know out there what to value, what's important, who we are, what's the place we're to play in the world. And so, one way to think of a temple is as a technology that human cultures have been using time and time again, in different ways, because every culture you could see as its own world, as its own environment, in different places in the world, in different scenarios of how things are laid out in front of you, to help the society as a whole and the individuals in it to know what the real world is and who they are and what is the place that they are to play in the world around them, right? So you oftentimes hear that temples of all sorts are supposed to be replicas of the universe and the cosmos. Okay, and when we hear those words now, we think like, okay, so where's the planets? Are there Milky Way somewhere? How about the black holes? Are they there? Because we've kind of been taught to think of the cosmos and the universe in terms of, again, scientific terms. But when the temple is laying, when you hear that a temple is supposed to be laying out the cosmos or something like that, you should think more in terms of the world, right? The world as you experience it in the world. So it's trying to tell you, if you're Harry Potter and you haven't yet seen all the things going on in the world, especially the unseen kind of structures and relationships in the world, that magical world beneath there, the temple is trying to get you to see how the world is laid out in terms of, those meanings of the world, which is the more magical, life-filled part of the world. And where things in that world fit, different aspects of the world and where they belong. And so where you are and who you are in that world, where you belong, where you could be. And what's very cool to see that temples have played this part across humanity in this way. You see it whether it's with what we would consider more primitive people in terms of tribes that let's say in a initiation ceremony, a rite of passage to manhood that we talked a lot about in a previous live stream. They would take the initiates and they would create a place, essentially a kind of makeshift temple, I guess, out in some sacred part of the landscape where they would create the kind of the mythical world, you could say, of their gods and the spiritual forces around them. And then the elders, the older males, would even dress up, again, not to just represent these gods, but to actually invite these gods to come and be there present with them so that the initiates could then be shown, okay, here is the grand story you're in. Here are the gods, around you that you worship. Here is the story of how they came into being, how you came into being, and here is what is now expected of you in this tribe. Here is what a man is, and here is what a man does, and the man's relationship to the gods and whatnot. So in that, you can see that is what they've done there is they've created a temple, okay? And so if you can see something as simple as that, well, then you look at all the different kinds of temples around you in the world, and you start to see, oh, that's what they were up to there. Trying to show what's really going on in the world, what the arena really is like in the world, who you are in it, and how you can act effectively in it, okay? So, again, and through this, I welcome any comments or questions along the way. If I see enough of them, I'll do a little pause and kind of address anything that you want to talk about along the way. Otherwise, I'll just kind of keep on going through the presentation. So let's go back to our first scenario, to that desert landscape. And imagine in that landscape where, again, you had no sense of direction or anything. Now imagine if you had something placed there in that landscape. And we're going to imagine a mountain in the landscape. Okay? So if suddenly in that desert landscape where you had no sense of direction, where you should go, you now have a mountain, well, what can that mountain do? if by having a mountain there in the landscape, now you have a reference point, okay? So the mountain itself is something stable. It's going to stay there. Very difficult to remove a mountain, right? And so wherever you are in the landscape, now you can travel around and you can always judge where you are in relation to that mountain. You know that you're closer to it. You know that you're farther away. You're on this side of it. You're on that side of it. You know, now your environment's completely changed by having a fixed reference point, okay? So temples, almost ubiquitously across humanity, have been tied up with mountains for reasons that we'll keep on exploring again and again in the series. And so you see, if a temple is a mountain, what is it? It's a fixed point. It's an axis. It's something that's there and stable, a reference point by which, again, not a geospatial reference point, although in like a medieval setting, with a cathedral in the middle of a town with a wall around it, it could be a geospatial reference point to help you guide yourself. But far more important is the map of meaning that it represents. It's going to tell you how far you are from the center, the center of life, the central point, the highest point in life. And what's the highest point? We always think of high in terms of a hierarchy. So what is higher up on a hierarchy? What's lower? What's closer to the central point of your society? Or, what is the center of your society in terms, again, of meaning, and what's farther away from it? Where are you in relation to that? Once you have that reference point fixed, then you can know. So that's the first, the first great benefit of this technology. We're used to thinking in terms of technology. See how this is a kind of psycho-technology. It does have a physical aspect in that it's a building usually, but it's something that's going on with your relationship in terms of, again, meaning and your mind and your identity. And so it's something more like a psycho-technology rather than something like our iPhone that runs off of silicon and transistors and all that kind of stuff. Bound up with this, the way that these set up a story of meaning is beyond just hierarchies and just a map. The map usually is presented to you in the form of a story, because stories are awfully nice in terms of meaning, because stories deal with kind of a development over time, and that is sometimes more useful than just a straight out map, because we develop over time as well. We're stuck in this arrow of time, and so life feels much more like an ongoing story to us than it does just some fixed point in time and space. And so that's why within these temples, part of the way that the map of meaning is presented is in the form of a story, a grand drama usually. And then you are picked out and said, okay, here's your part in the story. The other cool thing about how this works as a technology is that this isn't just a map of kind of a singular point, it's a fractal map. And in again, also previous episodes, we've talked about the fractal nature of reality, that once you see there are certain patterns in the world that repeat at several different layers of being, okay? So here's what I mean by that. A fractal is something that's like a pattern within a pattern within a pattern. And so whatever level of being you look at, so that would be like whether it's the level of God and the whole world, or whether you're talking just about a city, or whether you're talking just about you, the pattern repeats, okay? So you'll hear of temples, referred to as like, you've probably heard the phrase, the body is a temple, okay? And that's because in the pattern of your body, you have the very same attributes that does a temple, okay? And like, here's why. You have you are kind of formed in the same shape. You have this head that's more narrow, your body goes out, and the head is above, right? And the body is kind of below. And so you see a temple is also shaped like that, with a narrow structure at top, kind of pointed towards heaven. Temples are ubiquitously seen as unions of heaven and earth, of body and spirit. So the temple as a structure, when it's a building, is supposed to house the spirit of a god or gods, right? Well, what are you in terms of how you're usually conceived? You're a body and you're a mind, or you're a body and you're a spirit, right? The temple has a perimeter to it, has kind of a thing that is not the things that are outside the temple and the things that are inside the temple. And, the temple itself is kind of more holy space. The things that are out are profane space. Well, again, look at you. You have a perimeter as to what you are and what others are, and you don't like people coming too close into your space, right? Unless you're looking for some sort of communion with that person, because you want to have an identity of this is me, and outside of me is kind of the profane world. The temple has a heart, it has more deeper places that kind of house the more essential part of the temple, the more important part. You, again, have a heart. I'm not talking about the beating thing per se. I'm talking about, what you keep in your heart, and your essence, that thing that's kind of closer in on you. And so if you can see that a temple has that and you have that, well, a city is structured like that, right? It has limits and borders. It has a margin. It has a heart. It has a head. It has a body. And so you can see how at every different layer of reality, a temple is supposed to show you how everything has that. And if we'd have more time, we can show you how even the objects that you see around you, again, everything you see in reality has that kind of relationship of a body coupled with a spirit, for example. And that's kind of the prime pattern of a temple. If you learn nothing else like today, the prime map of what a temple is a union of heaven and earth, body and spirit, okay? And that pattern right there gets repeated out in everything in reality, okay? Including you, including a city, including a can of soft drink that's sitting here right next to me. That thing, you have to wonder, like, why do I see it as one thing? This can. Why would I just call it a can? Why didn't I just call it, oh, that's just part of the world out there? Well, that's because, again, there's something that's holding that together. It's kind of a structural, functional organization of the can, and it has a spirit. And the spirit is this concept of can, right? And so there's a union of that concept of a can with this actual physical matter right here. And again, do you see that pattern repeated? So hopefully you see that's just a little example of how this kind of works and how a temple is trying to show you reality at its most base level. All right, so let's think of the other kind of quick attributes of a temple that show how it's a map in a culture, in a society. It's the highest point and the most central point. We've said that. We've also said it's the mountain. It's the mountain of a society. So in addition to just being a place you can kind of judge how far away you are from the temple, right? The other thing that is almost ubiquitous about temples when they're presented as mountains, and so many are, is they're presented as the origin place. Sometimes as kind of the navel of the world, or the primeval place, or the place from which the world came into being. Which is why even with like the Latter-day Saint temple, there is this sense of it's tied up with creation, it's tied up with an original paradise. That's very often the case. It's, temples are tied up with an original paradise where everything kind of emerged. And so in as much as it's that, it's not just a place to orient yourself by, it's actually a destination. Okay, because very often the summit of this temple is presented as that's where you want to be. You want to actually climb this mountain, and why? Because up from that mountain, if you can have a reference point by the temple, well, imagine what it would be like at the top of that mountain. You can then see everything around you. The higher you up on the mountain, the more you can see in the landscape. You get to the top of that mountain, and what can you see? Everything, right? And wouldn't that be awfully nice in terms of meaning? So not just a, again, physical landscape that you can see around you, although that's kind of the symbol, but more, what if you could see everything in meaning, a 360 degree of meaning around you? Well, wouldn't that be awfully nice, right? Another thing to see as a temple as a map. Notice how temples we just assume this. We know this is the case. They don't move. They don't spin. Okay? And you say, of course not. Like, it's a temple, it's a mountain. Why would it spin? Well, certain things in life do spin, as it turns out. For example, there's a place where you go and almost everything's spinning, and that would be a carnival or a circus. Notice how you go to the carnival, the state fair, whatever it is, and notice how everything's spinning. and you've got you've got clowns spinning, and you've got machines spinning, and you get on these rides and everything's spinning. Why? Because spinning is change. Spinning is things in commotion. It can be a renewal, a recreation, a recreation, right? But it's also something that's unstable. And that's why you go, to experience. You go to the carnival to experience kind of that feeling of instability and things turned upside down in the ways that they are. Well, notice temples are like the exact opposite. Like the last thing you'd want is to go to a temple and it turns into, the gravitron at the state fair that spins you, and you're pressed up against the walls of the temple. That would not be the kind of experience that most people would seek out at a temple. So it's just important to realize how they are this fixed point, and hence why they're usually stuck or made out of stone, out of something incredibly lasting, to kind of just, again, transmit that fixed central nature, unchanging nature by which people can then, count on, orient themselves on, etc. Okay, so now let's get into some specific temples. We've been speaking a lot in the abstract, and I hope I haven't lost too many of you just talking so much in the abstract, but I hope you could at least keep these images in your mind. So let's go to some of the temples that are most present to us. We'll start with cathedrals, okay? And we'll see how the very structure and way that a cathedral is laid out is meant to, again, show you kind of where everything belongs. And so you start on the outside of the cathedral, and you'll find a limit, a border, a margin, to the structure of the temple. And very interestingly, and this is why one of the reasons I love cathedrals, is the crazy things that you see there on the outside of a cathedral. So one of my favorite cathedrals, or I guess it's a basilica, is the Sagrada Familia. I've heard of that a lot. And on the outside, you'll find lizards on the outside, slugs. What else? Kind of other, strange kind of creatures like that. But, you go to Notre Dame or whatever, and what is on the outside? Gargoyles. I've talked about how there's this cathedral in, I believe, Freiburg, Germany, that we went to, and you find these, I can't even remember if they're like little elves or gnome kind of creatures, and they have trumpets, and they're doing different things with their trumpets, and the water will come out of their trumpets, just like the gargoyles, the mouth comes out of the water. And lo and behold, there's like one that's playing, that's has the trumpet up to his butt, and the water comes out of there, and you're just like, aren't we supposed to be at a sacred kind of place? And you're like, what is going on with these kind of things? Well, notice that's at the margin, the border of this world that's being presented to us. And what is at the margin of world? Monstrous things, silly things. And that's the proper place for such things in the world. And interestingly, there's even this concept that those monstrous, silly things might be able to channel some of the things that lie beyond the borders of the world, which is usually water and chaos. They're able to channel some of that away from the more central parts of the world. That's a lot to chew on, and it's taken me a long time to think, what does that actually mean in real life? But I'm just putting it out there, so hopefully you can think about it. But you go into the cathedral, and you start looking around, and you notice some things. So, for example, almost always there's images everywhere around you, and as you look at the images, you notice some patterns. Down at the level where you are, there's usually images of either plants or animalistic kind of things, more down at that base level, or maybe more human things. But as you start looking up a little bit, you'll see, the saints a little bit higher up than that. Then above the saints there, you'll usually see angelic beings or prophets, or along the kind of more spiritual beings. Usually then there's the angels and whatnot, and then you get up top and you start seeing at the highest places, you'll find Christ, you'll find Mary, you'll find something that represents God the Father themselves. So again, it's a map, right? It's showing you where things belong in the hierarchy, with animalistic things below humans, saints above you, and the highest things up above you. And then with the cathedral, we were talking about this last time, ultimately there's a central nexus place in the cathedral, which are usually shaped in the form of a cross. And we're saying, of course, the cross, you're like, well, it's just because Jesus was crucified on a cross. But the cross in and of itself has always been a symbol, or has been one for the longest time in humanity, because it's this union point of two kind of opposite things. A vertical point, which again has that hierarchical nature, a heavenly kind of masculine nature, if you will. And then there's a horizontal that has more to do with its earthly nature, less hierarchical, flattening, equality kind of nature. And it's the union of the two that is Christ, you could say, or Christ lies at the center of those two, because he was both the highest thing and the lowest thing, right? He was the union of heaven and earth and earthly matter. And his life was full of these contrasting opposites of him being both, the crown of thorns is this great symbol because it's both this crown that he wears at kind of the culminating moment of his life, but it's a crown of thorns, being the lowest thing. And you see that imagery like in the cathedral over and over, even to the point of what's right there at the central kind of nexus of those two things, usually the altar. So what's an altar? Well, that's kind of like a raised mountain. So again, it's mapped kind of thing. So you're in the mountain, a cathedral, like we said, but now there's a mountain within the mountain. Well, that probably means that's like extra important, right? Pay attention to the mountains on the mountain, you could say. And what goes on the top of what takes place at the top of that altar, you have, the bread and the wine in a cup. And even there you say, two things, and look at kind of the nature of these two contrasting things. One is kind of a thing of stability, of, seen as kind of staff of life and tied up with life. And the other one is seen as tied up more with change, transition, right? Kind of getting you the revelry and recreation in the wine. And yet both represent Christ, again, that vertical and that horizontal dimension to things. So again, here you have then a map of the cosmos, you could say. You have a limit and marginal things in their place at the margin. You have a hierarchy laid out to you of kind of spiritual beings or life and the kind of the hierarchy of living things, you could say. And then you have an ultimate central place showing you the highest thing and its nature. So you have Christ represented there at the very center of the cathedral in a dual nature of this combined, highest and lowest kind of thing, or stability and change kind of notion. And so, there you have in the cathedral. These are just some of the basics. I'm not saying this exhausts the cathedral by any means, but you have some of the basics that show you, okay, here's what's showing us what's important in life and where you belong in it. You see in that hierarchy of spiritual beings where you are. And if you look around at the stories, we'll get into this, you'll find a story of where kind of you came from and where you're supposed to end up in the cathedral. So an example right there. Yesterday we talked about the Jewish temple. I wanted to kind of go through that structure again because especially in the Judeo-Christian tradition, most temples kind of go off of that temple, which was then, just the pattern of the tabernacle given to Moses, which was just the pattern of reality that God gave to Moses on the top of where? On the top of a mountain, right? And so in the Jewish temple, you'll see the same kind of thing where you have a limit to the temple itself. You have the temple complex, and certain people are not allowed into the temple complex, or maybe, I think everyone's allowed into the court of the Gentiles, the outer kind of part of the complex. But then in the more central part of the temple complex, then it's only Jews that were allowed. And in a certain part, there was a part where only the women could go, right? And a more central part only where the men could go. And then past a certain point, only where the priests could go. And then past a certain point, into the Holy of Holies, only where one, the high priest could go at a certain point of the year. And you just keep on going down. Even in the Holy of Holies, there's a central part to that. There's a foundation stone, or the Ark of the Covenant, which has, what's supposed to be there at the Ark of the Covenant, the presence of God, or the Shekinah. Inside the Ark of the Covenant was what? The covenant with the people, or the tablets of stone, or the Torah. There's different ways it can be seen, but you can see right there, we're given a map as far as how society is laid out for the Jewish people. And if it's one thing that you can't argue for many Jews, it's that God lies at the center. You can't argue that he doesn't lie at the center of their society, and that the Torah doesn't lie at the center of their society, in as much as that was seen. It's one way of seeing what was there at the very center of the temple. And many Jews, that continues to be the central focus of their life. And we see it right there in that map of the temple. So again, that does not at all exhaust the Jewish temple, and there is so much more going on there. And then you have different versions of the Jewish temple. You can go to the Temple of Solomon and look at its features. You can go to the tabernacle and look at its features. Again, why is the tabernacle the outer coverings, coverings of animal hides, for example, on the outer part of it, on the kind of marginal part of it, and then there's different materials and things going in. But I'm just trying to give you some examples from things that I think a lot of you would be familiar with of how temples are structured and why they're structured in that certain way. Again, it's not just because it was nice building material or to look nice, or because some artisan was making a gargoyle just because it was a whim of his. It's because inherent in the structure of a temple is a notion that things are laid out into a world or a cosmos where and things are placed in the places they belong. So then you can go and experience the temple over and over and start to figure out, here's the meaning of things in the world. Here's where marginal things belong. Here's where angelic things belong. Here's where I belong. Here's where the notion of a sacrificial thing belongs and its meaning. Here's altars in the temple. That's like the raised place. What's going on top of the altar? Why is that more important than other things going on around it? And so, what I'm hoping to accomplish here is to just get you that basic sense of a map, the temple as a map. And we're going to have so much more to say in these other episodes, but if we can at least just get to this notion of the temple as a map, then that's such a good starting point and should already give you, anytime you visit a temple, whether it's a Stonehenge, right? Again, a lot of these places we have so little information, it's much more difficult to get to conclusive things, but you can go to Stonehenge and see some interesting things, such as concentric circles. My guess would be more important things probably took place in the center circles than the exterior circles. I don't know that for sure because it's very difficult to know. Even the scholars all disagree about what went on there. At certain points with different groups have used Stonehenge, and I know there were altars there at least some point. But you also notice, again, some interesting things like outside of the circle itself, there is a stone that is not cut in the same way as the others. There's an uncut stone, an unfinished, uncut, more natural stone as opposed to the structured ones inside. And this is, again, with temples, something that you find out in marginal areas or whatnot. You'll find something that represents something more natural, unfinished, more wild, more dynamic, you could say, as opposed to the more structured inner part. Again, these dualities you notice again and again, and then the union of these dualities ultimately is something that you see in all these structures. So now, having that kind of thing, let me show you one more example of how this works in an entire image. And then, I know this is supposed to be about the Latter-day Saint temple. We'll end by showing you what's at the center then of, as far as the Latter-day Saint map, in as much as temples are maps, what lies on the map of this central place of Latter-day Saint life and culture and whatnot. And so you can see, here's people who, in more recent times, the last couple hundred years, which is recent as far as religions go, here are how people have structured their more central identities, parts, their map of meaning. Okay, so we'll get to that in just a sec. But I wanted to show you this. This is an image from one of my favorite thinkers, whose name is Jonathan Pageau. I bring him up all the time. And this is an incredibly useful image. He calls this a cosmic image or an image of everything. So he's an icon carver for the Eastern Orthodox Church. And this image, I hope you can see it in reasonable detail, in essence gives you that same structure I've kind of been talking about already. Okay, and so I want you to see how this, in essence, you could say this is a picture of the temple. You say, well, it doesn't look like it at all. I'll say, okay, well, let's look at it again, and we'll see that this is a temple. And if you can see how this is how a temple is laid out, you can go to temples of all sorts, and you'll find the same kind of elements in them. So first thing that's helpful on this is to kind of split the way that you look at this image in terms of up and down and left and right, okay? And you'll find that there are specific things going on, that give you a map as to things that are higher and things that are on the left and things that are on the right throughout this image. But at the very beginning, let's just look at the structure here, the kind of central thing underlying the whole thing, and you see that it's a mound or a mountain. And this is supposed to represent the mountain of paradise, the Garden of Eden, in essence. A lot of people don't have the Garden of Eden in their mind as a mountain. They think of it as something more flat. But first of all, there's the fact that 4 rivers emanate from it. And if you look close, you'll see rivers emanating from the top of this. But there's also in Ezekiel some verses that refer to the paradise as a mountain type structure. So there's a lot of reasons to think of it as a mountain, in as much as this symbol of the mountain is then used throughout the entire Bible to also kind of give you the structure of an ascent to God, or a return to God, if you will. And if man originated in the garden, then they were already there in the on the mountain. So you see that it's a mountain, and what does it have around it? It has a wall. It has a perimeter. And if you look closely at that perimeter, there's kind of little monster faces with some of that water that's emanating from the top flowing out of it, right? And then it reaches an ultimate perimeter of this dry land, and you get to this ocean. And in many ancient kind of cosmologies, which again are just maps of the world, this is how the world was always laid out, as dry land surrounded by ocean. And why would that be the case? Because that's how the world is experienced. You head off in any direction, you're bound to find ocean. And so the world was surrounded, as far as people experienced it, by ocean. And what did the ocean always represent? Even from the beginning verses of Genesis, it represented primeval potentiality or chaos, or the things from which everything emerges, things that are unorganized. So there in the first verses of Genesis, you have these kind of primeval waters from which the world is then organized and created, right? And those waters never really go away. They're always out there somewhere. That's why, when needed, such as in the story of Noah, the world can come back and be flooded and renewed by these kind of chaotic potential waters that create a new, a recreation of things. And so you see that's in this image. You go, as you go up the image, you're going to see different trees represented there. You'll see in the middle, so you're going to see Adam and Eve in this. Always Adam on the right, always Eve on the left, as far as in relation to Christ, which is the central figure. So Adam is on the right hand of Christ, Eve on the left, as far as Christ is there at the top. And as you go up the image, in the middle, you have the tree of the knowledge of good and life with the serpent, or good and evil, with the serpent there on it. At the top, you have a tree of life that he has combined purposefully with a cross, okay? And again, as you go through the image, down at the bottom again, you'll see that there's sheep drinking from the water on one side and goats on the other. You'll see, down here at the bottom, there's this skull in the middle, right there at the very margin of the world, representing the death, or the skull of Adam, kind of the fact that all men die. And then up at the top, you have another head that's there, which is the head of Christ, which is also surrounded by a darkness, which often, represents death. But again, Christ is this union of up and down, of left and right, in that he goes into death and produces life, right? And so, anyway, if you can, the best thing to do is that Jonathan Pageau has a whole 35-minute description of all the elements that he put in here, and go listen to him because he does it much better. But the thing that I wanted you to see is that this is how a cathedral works. This is how a temple works, okay? You're given, on the one hand, there's a story here, there is a drama, you could say. There's a place where you're actually suggested as having a place in this drama, because take Adam, for instance. The name Adam means humanity. Okay, so you can see Adam and Eve as individual characters, or you can place yourself into them and say, oh, well, that means if I'm a member of humanity, I'm Adam. Okay, what's going on with Adam in this drama of this story, right? And so you also have the story of Christ embodied in here. By the way, this is also how icons work, or most imagery inside cathedrals or Eastern Orthodox use icons in part of their regular worship, and this is how they work. They're structured. They have a symbolic structure of relationships in them that is meant to help you understand and relate to principles and concepts that exist in the world, to help you see aspects of reality and commune with different aspects of reality and commune with God. A lot of people say, well, isn't it just that they worship them? You're like, well, what do you mean by worship, right? That's where, when you start to see how something like this works, you see, okay, I can see the value in these kinds of images, both in thinking about them, but also just experiencing these images. Because the first time you look at any of these things, especially if somebody's not there to like point out explanations, it's hard to take all this stuff in. That's how it feels going into a temple of any kind. You're like, what is going on here? And that's part of it, is that the insights come from usually a lifetime of returning again and again to these temple places, but even more than that, participating in something, a ritual, right? That brings in all this imagery, that dramatizes the story, and then you're participating in it. And so this will be other episodes, and through this, that's where you realize, okay, over time and time doing that again in that participation, then the structure of all this comes to be not just something that I'm learning about intellectually, but something that's actually transforming me, that I'm participating and I'm practicing, like somebody practices a sport, so that you leave the temple and then these patterns are more imbued in you as you live out in the world. Okay, that's the basics of how it's supposed to work. So I wanted to end, before we get into the Latter-day Saint structure and the way that it is, by pointing out one sort of other temple that kind of, again, gets structured in this exact same way, and it's why it resonates with people so much, and that's why I'm going to use it. Okay, and it's this temple right here. And so this, of course, is the Temple of Hogwarts, you could say. So I keep on referring back to Harry Potter because I know that you'll know what I'm talking about, in as much as that we're so embedded into this story. Anyone that's my age or younger will know exactly all the elements that I'm talking about in this. So if you think about Hogwarts and the way that whole arena is laid out, it's laid out exactly like a temple, right? There's a perimeter to Hogwarts, and outside the perimeter are more dark and scary and monstrous things, right? But it's interesting because it's not just bad monstrous things, but there's some good monstrous things out there too. And there's Hagrid, who kind of lives right at that border, and he's the one that can kind of be this intermediary, right, between the monstrous things, the good monstrous things, and kind of warn you from the bad monstrous things again. And he's that marginal kind of character there. And then down at the very bottom of Hogwarts, just like you saw in this other image of Jonathan Pajot, there's a big dragonous serpent that lives down there that we see in the second movie. You go to Hogwarts, and what is the primary thing you get there when you arrive? You get an identity inside Hogwarts, with the sorting hat and being sorted into houses. And notice the identities. Everyone gets put where they belong, right, in Hogwarts. And there's different types of identities. There's ones that are kind of like that pure, noble kind of thing with Gryffindor. And there's the more kind of sinister, changing, tied up with a serpent, again, just like in Christianity, the Slytherin type people. And they're different people belong in different places. In a temple, everything is put where it belongs, right? And there are good and bad things that can come from all of the different kinds of forces. You see that kind of, again, through Harry Potter, you see this interplay of kind of the light and the dark throughout the story, even in Harry himself, in the ways that, is darkness all bad? Is it all just Voldemort? Or is sometimes, there's this darkness kind of inside Harry. Is it helping him sometimes? Is it not? Is it all just supposed to be good and light and, kind of love? Or is there kind of this combination of forces that actually ends up in the more full individuals, right? So you have that. Then there's the up and down nature in Hogwarts as well, right? So we told you there's that big Leviathan serpent monster, dragon monster down in the basement of Hogwarts, and then up at the top, who do you have? You have Dumbledore, who is very easily a symbol of a kind of godlike, progressed being. He's the goal. He's what he's what Harry wants to be like, essentially. And when you're in the temple, in the proper place, you'll be able to commune with kind of the god of the place. You could say, Dumbledore is much kind of the god of Hogwarts, if you will. And in as much as they please Dumbledore and whatnot, they can interact with him from time to time, but it's a little fleeting. Dumbledore is kind of there when he wants to be and not when he doesn't want to be. And even with Dumbledore, there's these notions of sacrifice, of self-sacrifice tied up with him. Refer back to, the Jonathan Pageau image where you have God up there at the top who sacrificed himself and whatnot. So, why... The question is, with something like Hogwarts and whatnot, why does this all just make so much sense naturally with people? Why do people accept it? It's because, it was a very good portrayal of these kind of basic aspects of the world that we know in some sense portray things as they are. And that's why you can live in this world and feel like, oh, yeah, I understand this world. One more thing is, how Hogwarts is this place of instruction. Temples end up being, in as much as it's a map, you have to kind of get instructed in the map, if you will, to enhance your ability to operate in the world, if you will. So there's instruction tied up with Hogwarts, but there's even play, and we're going to get to that in other episodes. And so Hogwarts has, of course, Quidditch as kind of the main, play thing that's going on. But even that play is tied up with these notions of identities. And so Jordan Peterson does a very good job at kind of pointing out how, the seeker is kind of the most important character in Quidditch, and the seeker's going after the golden snitch, this golden ball, that if that thing is obtained, the whole game is won through that. So again, you can see Hogwarts is essentially a temple, and it works if you can see how Hogwarts is laid out and the elements in it and why you respond to that. Again, you can go to any of these sites, any temples. I haven't used as many Eastern temples or Hindu temples just because I'm less familiar with the imagery, but any stuff that I've seen there are elements, of course, of all these things in those temples as well. Is it all just one-to-one correlations? No, it doesn't work that way, right? But you see these kind of dualities of light and dark, of left and right, of heaven and earth, and of spirit and body. Those are the kinds of things you see across the board with most temples. So I wanted to point that out again with Hogwarts, just so you see how this works. And now you can go and start seeing the way that temples work in the world. And with that, let's transition over then to the Latter-day Saint Temple as a map of meaning for Latter-day Saints. What lies then in their central places, if you will? What lies in the higher places of the temple, as it were, as you progress through that particular map of meaning? And again, through this all, I invite any comments, any questions. At the very end, I'll stay on, and you're welcome to comment or just keep on going in conversation as long as you want in this. And so I'll stay, but we're kind of reaching the latter part of the presentation as we're talking about the Latter-day Saints. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of do this in a list format. On other episodes, we're actually going to kind of go through the progression in a chronological order in the Latter-day Saint Temple, but I'm just going to kind of give you a spattering of the things you can find within a Latter-day Saint Temple that are the maps of meaning for Latter-day Saints. So one is that there is a notion of covenants in the temple, and a covenant, a basic way to think of it is an agreement. Goes back to the covenant with Noah or Abraham, particularly Abraham in the Bible, where God does something that gods usually don't do, and that is that he makes an agreement with humans, right, or humanity, or his children, you could say, however you want to look at it. But he makes an agreement with them that if they do something, they'll, if they live a certain way or do a certain thing, then he'll do a certain thing. So inside the Latter-day Saints temple, maybe one of the central things, again, that lies at the heart of who Latter-day Saints are and how they define themselves is these notions of covenants, of making an agreement with God. And so the agreements, the part that is the human part, the part, the mortal part, you could say, duty of anybody that's going there to the temple. Here's some of the specific covenants that are made there. There's one of obedience, right, where you basically are just saying, I will obey God, principally, instead of other forces in the world. There's one of sacrifice, where you're saying, I'm willing to give of myself, even my own life, right, if in the service of God throughout my life. There's one where you say you're going to obey the gospel, and the gospel is seen as being found in the scriptures. Okay, so the holy texts, which includes the Bible, but for Latter-day Saints also includes a few other books. There is a law of chastity that you say to proclaim, which basically says you will only have sexual relations with somebody that you are married to. Okay, and then finally there is a law of consecration that you say that you will obey. And this one is kind of the culminating one. As far as a hierarchy, this one's at the top, because it essentially says you are willing to give everything to God in order to build God's kingdom on the earth, essentially. So this is kind of the all-in one, where you say, look, I'm willing to give everything I possess. I'm willing to give for God in the service of what God wants and building his kingdom on the earth. So with that one, you're really not messing around, But the funny thing is, when I first went to and engaged in these rituals by which you make these covenants with God in the Latter-day Saint temple, the funny thing was, I was like, I thought I already had agreed to this stuff outside the temple. So that's where, if you go to the Latter-day Saint temple looking for secret things or new things or things like that, you're going to be kind of disappointed, because when it comes down to it, most things are fairly basic in the way that as far as kind of the core of what is being presented and you are engaging in. But as I thought about it and kind of have, participated and learned about it, the fact was I'd never actually, covenanted with God to do these things. And I'd never seen them as kind of the core central things about being a Latter-day Saint. And so in as much as you see that these covenants are this important part, you kind of see to Latter-day Saints, this is a core part of their entire identity that gives them a reference in life, is the fact that they have said, I have made these agreements with God. And what is God's part, back in there is basically a process of God, making you more like him as you obey these covenants, of a greater communion with God. I would say that the closest thing I can compare it to as far as other traditions would be theosis in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, this notion of communion with God. I know the Latter-day Saints oftentimes, there's a notion, they think they're going to turn into gods and be gods and this and that. And certainly Latter-day Saints do talk like that a lot, but they don't live like that, you could say. Much more the notion of how this is lived out is a notion of as you keep these covenants, that's the way that Latter-day Saints talk about keeping of covenants, you then become more like God and come back into God's presence, okay, you could say, or commune more with God, participate with God, you could say. And so that's I think, the more really digestible way of understanding that aspect of it. So in as much as you go there to make those covenants in the Latter-day Saint temple, it automatically creates kind of a perimeter, if you will. There are those members of the church who have gone and have made those covenants with God, in as much they're kind of central to the Latter-day Saint identity, and then there's those who haven't. And it's very much the case that if you haven't gone to the temple and made those covenants, there is a boundary within the church, even within families. is kind of, there's a greater respect, you could say. There's a greater belonging to an inner part of the identity and the people for those who have gone. And you can see why, right? In a sense that I told you that the highest kind of covenant that's made is this law of consecration. So essentially, you've gone and said, hey, I'm willing to give everything for this. I'm all in. And so if other people are there also doing that with you, you're like, hey, we're kind of on the same team. We're on the same level. Whereas those who aren't all in to this degree, well, hey, we like them and we hope they'll get here at some point, but they're not going to have the same kind of identity, I guess, if you will. So those people that have gone to the temple who keep their covenants are granted a much higher level of respect for Latter-day Saints, in as much as these are the central things compared to those people that don't keep these covenants or have never made them, for example. And that's why you can go, if you're a Latter-day Saint that has gone to the temple, you can go anywhere in the world, essentially, and walk into a Latter-day Saint building. And as soon as people feel out that you're kind of a temple-going Latter-day Saint, somebody that's gone into this core part of and made the core commitments and stuff like that, you'll be there's markers that you can kind of tell these kind of people, because they'll be wearing what we call the garment, which is kind of an underclothing that we'll get to later. But you can kind of tell who these people are. And once people can feel you out that you're a temple-going Latter-day Saint, you're afforded kind of full, come to my house, come into me, full trust, you could say, right? Whereas those who haven't, gone into the central part and made the central commitments are treated with a little, it's not like they're treated rudely or as outsider, but just treated with a little bit less deference or trust, you could say. So again, that's how it works. It's a map of meaning to help you indicate who belongs, to a core and who doesn't, right? So that's important to see there. In the Latter-day Saint temple, there is a big focus on ancestors. Okay, so in which you go to the temple first to participate in rituals for yourself, but then subsequently you'll go back again and again to the temple, participate in the same rituals, but you'll do it on behalf of somebody who has died in the past. And so you'd say, okay, well, what's the significance of that on a map of meaning? That means Latter-day Saints really, really care about, you could say, their ancestors. I think that's the best way to put it. They really care about those who have gone along. They don't see them as being gone. They see them as continuing to exist in a world of spirits, and that there needs to be a continual communion with these ancestors in largely the ways that so many peoples across the world have communed with their ancestors. Again, in temples across the world, you'll find all sorts of, usually burial of ancestors or important figures around temples. Go to a cathedral or a church, you'll usually find the graveyard around it. Stonehenge, again, you'll find that they have all sorts of burial mounds and things tied up with this ritual complex. So we're not at all weird in this sense. But yeah, Latter-day Saints care a lot about their ancestors and their ancestors' well-being, because the whole notion of it is that you are doing this, you're taking your ancestors through these rituals, you're being their body, if you will, in so much that if they want to, they can participate in these rituals and kind of come into the same inner circle or the same participation with God that you have. So there's a notion of redeeming your ancestors. And I've even have another live stream on Coco, the movie Coco, that show how other cultures have very much the same kind of notions of communing and redeeming your ancestors. So again, this is not unusual at all. But again, in as much as that's happening in the temples, you can see that's core importance to the identity and what it means to be a Latter-day Saint is a care or concern for your ancestors. Okay, next thing is that you'll find is this notion of progression within the temple. So there's a whole ritual drama that we'll talk about called the endowment within the temple, in which you participate. It's essentially the drama that was in the Jonathan Pajot building. It's a creation story modeled off of the creation story in the Bible. It's Adam and Eve being cast out of the garden, but then a notion of returning back to ascend the mountain. Okay, and we'll go through that in more detail using just the biblical story, because again, that's the essence of it, almost entirely within the Latter-day Saint temple. But there's some kind of nuances and flourishes to that, and one of them is that in your return to God, you return to paradise, you return to the top of the mountain, you could say, there's this notion of continuing progress, that the progress doesn't end, you could say, a pattern of continual progress. And so even in the rituals themselves, there's kind of progression, a notion of progressing through worlds as you go through that. And you're, in the ritual itself, it's showing you kind of ritually progressing into these higher worlds. And in the highest, there's this notion of the progression never stops. And that right there, again, is who Latter-day Saints are. There are people who believe in kind of an eternal progression, right? And that's the notion of being like God, in as much as God is seen as a being that is a being in progress. And that differentiates us from people, because a lot of people see God as a being that is already everything that could be, whereas Latter-day Saints have this notion of continual progress, in as much as like God would always be out there, God to us, progressed, in the way a divine being is progressed out in front of us. But we don't like the thought of a stopping of progression, because a stopping of progression would be damnation, now wouldn't it? Because that's exactly what that means. So Latter-day Saints are big on a progression through worlds, and not just then you reach a static state where you just kind of hang out there, heaven where you're playing harps for the rest of the night. I know that's nobody actually sees heaven that way either, but I'm just trying to illustrate kind of the main point. Okay, another thing that's there is the notion of a binding of families is found in the Latter-day Saint temple. So our marriages actually take place in these temples, and they're not even called marriages, they're called sealings, which is this notion of binding together people in a way that is kind of a more significant binding than a typical, especially like civil marriage or something out there where it's till death do you part. These bindings are seen as much more enduring, even to an eternal nature. But it's not just a binding of spouses together. It's a binding of families together, family relations, so that these family relations endure. And so there's this notion of an eternal family. Ultimately, the whole human family is an eternal family, if you will. And you're seeking to make your family something that endures beyond just this mortal experience, if you want to say. And that the central kind of symbols of that in rituals take place there in the temple. So you can see that's central to Latter-day Saints. They care a lot about the binding of families together, not just in life, but through a spiritual kind of eternity. So anyway, again, that's what you find in a Latter-day Saint temple. That's your map of meaning when it comes to Latter-day Saints. You'll find all sorts of symbols of the union of masculine and feminine in Latter-day Saint temples. You'll find kind of things where the masculine and feminine, men and women, are separated at different points, and then there's points where they're coming together and being made into a one unit, as to suggest. So, and there's very much this notion in Latter-day Saint culture of people, men and women by themselves are incomplete, they're separate, and they need to be brought together and bound up, and becoming a one new living being in this kind of bigger concept of a being as a family. Okay, so that also you'll find right there in the Latter-day Saint temple. It shows you, as to Latter-day Saints, that's really important, and they place significant, or I should say we place significant focus on the nature of marriage and that union of masculine and feminine. In the Latter-day Saint temple, just as in so many other temples, you'll find altars, okay? And in typically what's always done on top of altars across temples, across humanity, is sacrifices. Okay, so in the Latter-day Saint temple, you're not going to find animal sacrifices or other types of food sacrifices like you do in a lot of other altars. Notice how even the atop the altar in a cathedral is a food sacrifice tied up, so it is food, but it's then tied up that God himself is the sacrifice there. And that's kind of where the Latter-day Saints take off on their notion of sacrifice on top of altars, is that all the things taking place above the altars, you could say, in the Latter-day Saint temple are people sacrificing themselves in different ways. And by sacrifice, I always mean this term of giving something up in the short term, binding themselves in some sense in the short term for something greater in the long term, right? And so it's over these altars that these covenants are made that I was talking about. And so you can see how, in the past, very much in the same ways, animals were used in the same way. Atop the altars is these sacrifices made to please God, to commune with God, to reach a greater level, of participation with God. Well, in Latter-day Saints, it's the same thing, but it's been abstracted, much like Christ did with the notion of the Eucharist or the communion or the sacrament, to be something that's more people sacrificing part of themselves conceptually, and not with physical animals or food is there. But just as in any other kind of temple, what happens above the altars is kind of the more significant stuff. Pay attention to what happens in the altars. So, for example, one of these altars is used in sealing, in that notion, the marriage that happens in a Latter-day Saint temple is done with the participants on either side of an altar. And all this stuff, you can see pictures on the Latter-day Saint Church's website of all these kind of things. You can find other descriptions. And as Latter-day Saint temples are built, you can actually go and visit them before they're dedicated or made holy and see how these things are set up. But just to point that out there, that this is all stuff you can kind of see for yourself. And then finally, the thing I'll end on is that both in most Judeo-Christian traditions that I've seen or seen, as well as the Latter-day Saint tradition, the temple itself, like in its whole, in its entirety, is supposed to represent Christ. And so inasmuch as the temple is the central place, the central meaning of the Latter-day Saint people, Christ is at that center. So the full name of the church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that really does lie at the center. And so all the rituals, all the meanings that are there in the Latter-day Saint temple ultimately are bound up with a way of trying to, again, approach or be more like Christ, or understand Christ more, or participate in Christ's nature to a greater degree. And so the temple itself, in as much as, again, you have this body that's filled with the Spirit of God, that's Christ, right? He came and he had a body here on earth, but coupled with, the Spirit of God himself, making him this union of man and God. And so the temple in and of itself, just like I would guess most Judeo-Christian, Christian notions have this are bound up with also this conception of a cathedral or the temple in the Old Testament was representing Christ. The tabernacle was Christ. And with the Latter-day Saints, it's the very same thing. And in as much as the temple is the central focus of the society, the axis around which the society turns, Christ is at that center and is bound up with the temple itself. So that is how you understand what the Latter-day Saints are about. And with that, I think that is what I had to say today. Again, the most important thing is seeing how temples are maps of meaning. That was obviously the title of this, and I hope I've given you enough examples now, both I focus a lot on Christian and Jewish examples because they're the ones that we're most familiar with in culture, but hopefully I have enough of a little smattering, and I'm going to try to do a better job through this series of pulling in other examples from other temples to show you that, of course, there's not like strictly Christian conceptions in many other temples, but there are conceptions of unions of heaven and earth, for example, masculine and feminine, and those kind of things that are in the Christian conception bound up with the identity of God and the identity of Christ and things like that. So anyway, I hope that has become clear, and I've given you tools and skills, or at least opened up kind of your mind to going into these kinds of sacred spaces and seeing what's going on, right? But also, I hope that you can go to something like a American football match or college sports or something and see like, yeah, here's an arena, and here is a structure here that is defining a world. And look at me, I'm wearing like a horned hat and painted my face, and I participated in the parade up to this, and I'm eating this food that you can only get here at the stadium, and I'm participating in this identity. It's like, oh yeah, okay, I can see how this is a temple too, and there's a map here of what's important. You have the game space itself, and the arena there, and the people participating in that, they're important. And up, in the higher reaches there, you have kind of the dignitaries and authorities being set up as who's important there at the stadium, right, in the higher places of the stadium. And there's a whole hierarchy of a world being set up there, and where you fit in that world and how you participate in it. And lo and behold, lots of people see their local sports team or their team that they root for as like some core part of who they are. And then they go and they commune in these sacred spaces with them. Hopefully you can see now, a football stadium, there's another map of meaning, right, that people participate in. And so you can see this way that temples work, and have again more tools to be able to kind of feel out how they are transforming you, or they could transform you in your life. So I've been pleased to see that there's been for me at least a reasonable amount of people that have stayed in on this. Again, this is all a rough draft to hopefully be put in a tighter package, something more like a half an hour, which is better done through images and music and a tighter script and whatnot. But I'm glad to see some of you still on here. I would love to see any more. I'm going to sign off here, so any questions or comments that you want to give, feel free to do so now. Otherwise, I'll sign off. And today there's been a little bit less participation in the chat as usual. Not a bad thing, but anyway, I just want to make sure everybody realizes you are more than welcome to participate, and I hope that you do in the future. So as far as this series, the next time I pick up on this will either be Monday or Tuesday of next week. The rest of this week of the live streams that we're doing, again, just more explanation. This is a part of a project of a series of live streams I'm doing for 90 days, just to put out in rough draft form a bunch of ideas that I have. And as much as Mission Top is a place of ideas, we're going to put them all out there and hopefully hone them, get them better in this process of having to explain them, all in efforts to then make better videos of them in the future. An example of how that works is last week I put out a video essay on the waterfront and tied that into notions of manhood. So you can see kind of how these live streams, in as much as I did a whole stream on manhood or series on manhood, helped me to make then a more polished video essay with music and clips and all that kind of stuff that culminated into something different. So just again, want to kind of explain what's going on here and how you can continue to participate, which is, again, Monday through Friday, there'll be these streams. You can subscribe and you'll get to see, okay, what the stream is going to be about. You can tune in when you want to, participate. And I've very much enjoyed people's thoughts and comments in ways that help me to make these ideas even better. So thank you for being here, and I'm going to sign off now. Again, Ed and Linda Malkus. I always like seeing new names, and almost every time there's a new name on here, and that really I love meeting new people, seeing new people on here. So thanks for being here. This is Gary signing off from Mission Top, and we'll see you back in the future.